the first print I purchased was by an Japanese artist named Munakata, and I bought it because I was ordered to buy it by the then curator of prints, Leona Prasi.
The idea of creating a print and being part of the legacy of the Print Club of Cleveland, going back to 1924, I found especially appealing.
Leona was a great force in the Print Club of Cleveland, which was founded in 1919 by Ralph King, who gathered a group of prominent Clevelanders around him. They were all collectors, and they decided that the fledgling Cleveland Museum of Art, at that time just 3 years old, should have an important collection of fine prints and drawings.
For example, for Coquillage, I saw this small seashell. I liked its shape, its fall, its color, and I thought it would be interesting to translate it into a work of art.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Ralph King, the founder of the Print Club. He was our first curator, and he did it as a volunteer for about a year. But he would travel to New York and visit art dealers there. There is a wonderful story that appears in William Milliken's little book, A Time Remembered. William Milliken, of course, was the director of the Art Museum for many years, very influential person, and he wrote a little book about Cleveland's cultural organizations and the people who were behind them. And he tells the story of Ralph King, the founder of the Print Club. Ralph King was very interested in lithographs by Toulouse-Lautrec. And so he went to New York and he went into Kennedy's gallery. And he said, "I'd like to see your lithographs by Toulouse-Lautrec." Well, they got out a number of lithographs, and Ralph King said, "I want them all." So then he went down the street to Knoedler's, and he bought every lithograph they had. He proceeded to all the art dealers in New York. He bought all the Toulouse-Lautrec lithographs that were there at the time and returned to Cleveland. And these lithographs eventually became part of the collection at the Cleveland Museum because, of course, he was so dedicated to forming this wonderful collection, which we now have.
This is a sketch of the subject which we were just discussing. Now, in this work, which is different than Coquillage, I conceived of it as a landscape and decided to execute it in the form of a monoprint or monotype, a much larger format, very much larger than Coquillage. In a single print like this, I work very differently than I would in a smaller format.
A year or so later, he went back to New York. This time, he was interested in Odillon Redon. And he started at Kennedy's. And when he had bought all the Redon prints in their possession, they got on the phone, and the word went down the street, "Get out your Odillon Redons, Ralph King is in town." He was such a blessing to not only the Print Club, but to the museum itself. He purchased from Rodin, for example, the great statue of the thinker, which has stood in front of the original Beaux-Arts building at the museum. But he had by 1926, at his death, after a relatively short time in the Print Club of Cleveland, had left more than 800 prints and drawings to the museum. So Cleveland owes him a great deal.
Alors là, je vais bercer une plaque. Enfin, je vais commencer à la bercer.
Here's the plate,
avec
and one begins to rock it with a tool called a berceau that has a lot of little points on it.
On fait des
So
diagonales.
one makes diagonals like this, like this,
Alors,
like
on le
this.
prend comme ça et on fait voilà.
And one takes it like this,
Alors,
and goes like
bouge,
this,
voilà.
making little motions like this.
Et on fait ça. Alors moi je fais ça, je fais des passes.
Following the lead of our early founders, such as the Kings, the Hannahs, the McBrides, Print Club members have always given gifts either from their own collections or through purchase to the museum.
It is the oldest such organization among American museums and has been supportive always over the years.
Non, c'était pour moi tout à fait naturel.
It was up to me to come up with the image for the Print Club of Cleveland. In other circumstances, if they had imposed an image or a certain format, the process would have been very different. But they allowed me to work freely.
In 1924, the club decided that it would commission an artist and publish a print, which would be given as a gift to its members. The curator of prints at the Cleveland Museum at that time was Theodore Sizer, and he thought it would be marvelous to have a print by the great painter lithographer George Bellows. So he had been carrying on a correspondence with George Bellows, who was very interested in making a publication print for the club. And it was virtually signed and sealed that George Bellows would do something for us. However, Mr. Sizer didn't count on the Print Club Publications Committee, which decided it did not want a lithograph, rather it wanted an etching. And that's how we got Henry Keller for our first print.
These are the proofs from Gaughan-Michitsch, the three plates. First the yellow, then the red over the yellow, and finally the blue, superimposed over the yellow and the red.
There's an irony to the story of George Bellows in the Print Club of Cleveland. Theodore Sizer had to write to George Bellows to apologize for not having a lithograph by him for the Print Club publication #1, because the Publications Committee had decided on an etching. Unfortunately, George Bellows died a year later in 1925, so the Print Club never got a lithograph by the great painter lithographer George Bellows.
I have several burnishers, one that has a fine point and one that is a little thicker. The plate looks like it has many lines on it now, but at this point, if I were to print it, the resulting image would be very vague.
Over the years, some of our publications have been done by high-profile artists such as Matisse, Rockwell Kent, Reginald Marsh, Bridget Riley, Will Barnett, Elizabeth Catlett, Thomas Hart Benton, Chico Munakata, Mark Tobey did a dry point for us. As a matter of fact, the print club publication of the Mark Tobey dry point is the only dry point he ever did. Leonard Baskin. This dry point by Martin Lewis is another one of our famous prints by an artist who's so highly regarded that we classify him as another one of the high-profile artists whom we have commissioned.
Feuille là, voilà. Alors, on écrase.
Okay, I rub the plate very
On fait
gently.
un
A first
premier,
pass, like this.
Un premier jet comme ça.
If you were to
On va
pull
mettre
it now, it would
on
look
dira,
finished,
on a
but it
l'impression que c'est
isn't.
fini, mais c'est jamais fini.
Henry Sales Francis was curator of prints with Leona Prossi as associate curator. Henry Francis was a very elegant gentleman. We have many of his letters in the archives, and he was also curator of paintings and very highly regarded in the world of art historians. Henry Francis was followed by Leona Prossi as curator, and she had her entire career at the Cleveland Museum of Art. She was a great scholar, a quiet little lady, but a person of tremendous influence. Many of the famous prints that we have as our publications were achieved as a result of her efforts. She wrote the catalog raisonné of the graphic work of Lionel Feininger, which is why the Print Club has published 4 prints by this famous artist, and why Cleveland is a real center for the study of Lionel Feininger. Well, the great Salvatore Dali was approached by Leona Prossi to see if, again in the 1940s, Leona requested a submission from him for a possible publication. Dali wrote back to say that since it was wartime, a copper plate was almost impossible to get, so he declined and said we would not be able, therefore, to do a print for us. Leona Prossi sent Dali a copper plate, so he was forced to do a publication print for us. He did St. George and the Dragon. It's a wonderful big etching, and Leona always said it was Dali's greatest etching. So we can be grateful to the Print Club of Cleveland for this very great work of art. The Charles Birchfield story is also very interesting. Again, it was Leona Prossi, and of course you see in these stories what a great influence she was on the club and on what we were able to publish. She approached Charles Birchfield to see if he would do a lithograph for us. Birchfield wrote back and said, well, he was very sorry, but he thought his printmaking was in the future. Leona got in touch with George Miller, the great printer in New York, and she asked George Miller to send Charles Birchfield instructions on making a lithograph, which George Miller did. He sent materials and instructions, so Charles Birchfield came up with 3 lithographs. One of them is called Summer Benediction. It's a very beautiful lithograph, much sought after by collectors. And it was all done as a result of a correspondence course with George Miller. Charles Birchfield talks about visiting George Miller in his studio in New York City. He said he ran into Feininger and Wangenroth there and was very enthusiastic about his visit, but he never made another lithograph. So the Print Club of Cleveland, again, can be patted on the back for having persuaded Charles Birchfield to do at least 3 lithographs.
Little by little, this is a very laborious work, and this is just a small plate. The larger the format, the more demanding the process.
Another one is Edmond Blancpied, who was a great British etcher, born on the Isle of Jersey, and went to London, worked in London, was very famous. During World War II, or after World War II broke out, he returned home to the island of Jersey, and we had commissioned a print by him about that time. It was about 1941. He submitted 3 drawings, and we selected one of the drawings to be made into an etching for us. The war came, he had returned to Jersey. The prints arrived in Cleveland, but we were unable to get word from Blancpied. A check for $500 representing the commission had been sent to him. It had never been cashed. So the print club mounted, I think in 1941 or 1942, an exhibition of the work of Edmond Blancpied. He was a painter. He painted in oil and watercolor. He was an etcher, a lithographer. He was a sculptor. And we had representatives of all these art forms in this wonderful exhibition, even though we had no idea what had happened to Blancpied. Following the war, a letter arrived in Cleveland to Henry Francis from Edmond Blancpied. We rejoiced in Cleveland that he was alive and well. The letter was extremely interesting. He stated that he had carried the check for $500 on his person throughout the war. The check had arrived the day the Germans occupied the island of Jersey, and he felt he would not be able to cash it, or he knew he couldn't. So he returned the check and said, if possible, I would like to have this replaced. If not, I would understand that that was just the way things were. The check, of course, was replaced, and again, all rejoiced that Edmond Blancpied was alive and well.
For the kind of work that I do, for this medium, I cannot be very spontaneous, and I have to make a very precise sketch beforehand. Still, I do take some liberties in the composition along the way.
There's a very interesting story about how we commissioned Hamaguchi, the great mezzotint artist, Japanese artist. Moselle Mills at that time was a very influential president in our history, and she had the club had wanted a mezzotint by Hamaguchi. He was living in Paris at the time, and nobody could get in touch with him. Moselle Mills went to Paris, and she tried to track down Hamaguchi, was not successful. However, on the day she was to fly back to the United States, A letter service she had used had succeeded in reaching him. He telephoned her, and she swung by his residence, and taxi waiting went in to have an interview with Hamaguchi. He had stopped doing mezzotins because of arthritis in his hands. The medium is an extremely demanding one, and he had abandoned the technique for which he was so very, very famous. And Moselle showed him a copy of our Red History book, which pictured the commission prints that we had to the point of our 50th anniversary. Hamaguchi looked at the book and he said, "Well, I'm going to have to try awfully hard, but I think I can do a small mezzotint for you." And as a result, he produced the Papillon Rouge, Red Butterfly, tiny little print, maybe an inch or two square. And it marked the return of Hamaguchi to the technique of mezzotint, which was a great boon for the rest of the world. It was Moselle Mills who took us abroad to Europe for the first time, a trip to France called Paths of Artists. Other trips followed to Italy. The Print Club has traveled all over the world as of this date.
I'm going to see what she's done.
We visit artist studios. We visit famous private collections all over the world. We travel in the United States. There's hardly a museum or an important collection that we haven't seen.
One cannot do a work or an image constantly wondering whether people will like it or not. With 250 people, you're going to get 250 different opinions. So, you can try to please everyone, or you can try to please yourself. And either they'll accept it, or they won't. And in the end, I thought this was the best solution.
But the big effort and the big thrust of the Print Club of Cleveland today is the print fair. It involves a great many people and a great effort. It's a wonderful service to the community. We are an educational group, and the print fair certainly educates. It really fills so many of our purposes and commitments. The fair provides a wonderful boon to the seasoned collector. It's a wonderful tool to educate the beginning collector. The Print Club publications, including preparatory drawings and canceled plates, which become part of the museum's permanent collection, form an overall history of printmaking from 1924 to the present. But one of the programs that the club loves to hear about was the time we sponsored a lecture by Gertrude Stein. There's quite a file of correspondence between Henry Francis, curator of paintings and of prints, between himself and Alice B. Toklas, writing for Gertrude Stein. We'll probably have a chance to read one or two of those letters, but the lecture was held in the auditorium at the Cleveland Museum. Miss Stein requested that she not be introduced, that no one sit on the stage with her, and that she didn't mind being interviewed by the press. She declined an invitation to dine with Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Coe, prominent collectors, Cleveland collectors of French Impressionist paintings, because prior to a lecture, she preferred to, quote, sup quietly and alone, end quote. After the lecture, a reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer interviewed one of the print club members who'd attended, and he reported enthusiastically that the lecture was absolutely wonderful, but he had no idea what it was about. The print club never hesitated approaching any artist, no matter how famous he was, to secure a publication. We tried Stanley Hayter, we tried Muirhead Bone, we tried Pablo Picasso, and that is a story in itself. We tried Picasso 4 times. The 4th time was to get a publication to be presented at the occasion of our 50th anniversary. In that case, we started out by asking Sherman Lee, our director, to write the letter. He began the letter Maître, and it proceeded in French. After that, we heard from Pierre Matisse, the son of Henri Matisse, because we had tried to get Picasso through him. He was an art dealer in New York, and we tried through various dealers in Paris. We tried through Paolo Boni, who lived in Paris and was one of our publication artists. And Boni said that we suggested that we not inform Picasso as to a possible subject, that he had to be approached very carefully and just when he was in the proper mood.
All the artists that have worked for the Print Club of Cleveland over the years, during the course of its long history, are so different. You cannot compare one to the other. Perhaps the one to whom I feel the most connected is Hamaguchi. We work in the same mezzo-tint technique, and we both gravitate toward the same subjects. It was especially meaningful for me to be in the same company as he. In fact, my entire experience of working for the Print Club of Cleveland was wonderful and very meaningful.
I am the self-appointed historian.
Well, that's an important.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'll tell you how it came into being. Nancy Wolpe and I spent a summer going through the entire archive of the print club. The museum was getting ready to undergo the renovation and expansion, and they wanted to store our material, and they wanted us to reduce it. In order to reduce it, we had to, of course, go through and read everything. And every time I found something that I thought was interesting, and there certainly was a lot, I rushed up to the photocopying machine and made a copy so that I could just have it. And when our job was finished, I thought, my goodness, this is awfully interesting material. I think I'd better be the historian for the Print Club of Cleveland. So I began to share with the membership at their annual meetings and also with the trustees at their meetings, a little story from the archives each time. So that's how it happened, and that's probably why I'm sitting here now.